The crack of leather against skin echoed across the Caldwell, Idaho train depot as Grace Turner collapsed onto the wooden steps, her pale blue dress stained with the first drops of blood from her split lip. The early summer afternoon of 1885 had started with promise a chance meeting with an old friend at the general store, but had spiraled into a nightmare when her husband Harold caught her laughing with another man, innocent as it was. "You think you can embarrass me in front of the whole town?" Harold snarled, raising his hand again, the signet ring on his finger glinting in the sunlight. The few bystanders scattered, averting their eyes from the brutal display that had become all too familiar to the residents of Caldwell. Wade Xanders saw it happen from across the street. He'd only been in town for 3 days, stopping to rest his horses before continuing north to the cattle auctions in Boise. A tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun, he adjusted his worn Stetson, dropped the reins of his bay stallion, and moved with the purposeful stride of a man who'd spent most of his 30 years in the saddle. "Mr." Wade's voice cut through the commotion, deep and steady as the distant rumble of thunder. "I believe you've made your point." Harold Turner spun around, his face contorted with rage. "This ain't your business, stranger. This is between a man and his wife." Grace looked up through strands of copper hair that had fallen loose from her once neat bun. Her green eyes, though brimming with tears, flashed with something that surprised Wade, not just fear, but defiance buried beneath years of submission. "When you beat a woman in public, you make it everybody's business," Wade replied, his hand resting casually near the walnut grip of his Colt Peacemaker. Harold glanced at the gun, then back to Wade's face, calculating his odds. The whiskey on his breath was palpable even from several feet away. "You threatening me over my own property?" A muscle twitched in Wade's jaw. "She ain't property, and yes, I reckon I am." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for Grace. Harold lunged forward, pulling a knife from his boot with practiced ease. Wade drew his pistol in one fluid motion but didn't fire. Instead, he sidestepped the attack and brought the heavy barrel down on Harold's wrist, sending the knife clattering to the planks of the platform. Harold howled in pain but charged again like a wounded bull. This time, Wade's fist connected with his jaw and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the dirt. A hush fell over the depot. The station master emerged from his office, spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Should I fetch the sheriff, Mr. Xanders?" Wade nodded, his attention already shifting to the woman on the steps. He knelt beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Madam, can you stand?" Grace nodded, though uncertainty flashed across her features. 6 years of marriage to Harold had taught her that kindness often came with a price. "I'm Wade Xanders," he said softly, offering his handkerchief for her bleeding lip. "Got a room at the hotel if you need somewhere to rest while the sheriff sorts this out." "Grace Turner," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper as she accepted the cloth. "And I think I'd better stay right here until Sheriff Dawson arrives. People would talk." Wade smiled slightly. "Let them." Sheriff Dawson arrived moments later, a stocky man with a gray-streaked beard and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. He took in the scene with a practiced glance. Harold still unconscious, Grace bleeding, and a stranger standing protectively nearby. "Mrs. Turner," the sheriff nodded. "This happen again?" Grace looked down, shame coloring her cheeks. "It ain't happening anymore," Wade interjected. "Man pulled a knife on me after I stopped him beating his wife." Dawson sighed heavily. "Harold's got a temper, especially when he's been drinking. Been warning him for months." He turned to Grace. "Madam, you want to press charges this time?" The question hung in the air like gunsmoke. Grace had been here before the bruises, the apologies, the promises to change. She looked at Harold's crumpled form, then at the tall cowboy who had intervened when nobody else would. "Yes," she said finally, her voice stronger than before. "Yes, I do." While 2 deputies hauled the still-dazed Harold to the jailhouse, Sheriff Dawson took statements from Wade and Grace. The story was simple enough: Harold's jealous rage, his public assault, the stranger's intervention. "You're new in town, Mr. Xanders," Dawson observed, scribbling notes in a small leather-bound book. "Just passing through," Wade confirmed. "Headed to Boise for the cattle auction." Dawson nodded. "Well, seems to me you've done this town a service. Turner's been a problem for years. Folks just look the other way, you know how it is." But Wade didn't know how it could be. Where he came from in Texas, a man who couldn't control his temper had no business raising cattle or horses, let alone taking a wife. His father had taught him that lesson early strength was for protection, not dominance. Mrs. Turner, Dawson continued, you got somewhere to stay tonight. Harold will be locked up, but I wouldn't recommend going home alone. Grace's hands twisted in her lap. My sister lives across town, but she's got 5 children in 2 rooms already. The Caldwell Hotel has a vacancy, Wade offered. I could speak to Mrs. Reynolds at the front desk. She seems a proper sort who wouldn't let gossip start. Sheriff Dawson seemed to consider this, then nodded. Emma Reynolds is a good woman, widow herself. I'll walk you there myself, Mrs. Turner, make sure everything's proper. That night, Grace sat on the edge of a narrow bed in room 4 of the Caldwell Hotel, her few hastily packed belongings in a carpetbag at her feet. Sheriff Dawson had accompanied her to her house to collect some necessities. Standing guard while Harold's brother James watched sullenly from the porch next door, a soft knock at the door startled her. Mrs. Turner, it's Emma Reynolds. I've brought some supper up for you. Grace opened the door to find the hotel proprietress, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, holding a tray of food. Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. You didn't have to trouble yourself. Nonsense, Emma replied, setting the tray down on a small table by the window. And call me Emma, everyone does. She paused, studying Grace's face with motherly concern. That lip needs tending. I've brought some witch hazel. As Emma dabbed the solution on Grace's injuries, she spoke in a low, conversational tone. That cowboy who helped you, Mr. Xanders, he paid for your room for the week, said to tell you there were no strings attached. Grace stiffened. I can't accept. Yes, you can, Emma cut in gently. Sometimes the good Lord sends angels in dusty boots, my dear. Accept the blessing and worry about pride another day. After Emma left, Grace sat by the window, watching the street below as twilight settled over Caldwell. She could see the saloon across the way, lanterns being lit one by one. A piano's tinny melody drifted up to her open window. And there was Wade Xanders, emerging from the livery stable where he'd been tending his horses. He crossed the street with that same purposeful stride she'd noticed earlier and disappeared into the saloon. Grace touched her swollen lip absently. In 6 years of marriage, no one had ever intervened when Harold's temper flared. Not her friends, not her neighbors, not even the pastor who had seen her bruises when she carefully adjusted her sleeves during Sunday services. But a stranger had done what no one else would. She didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified of what tomorrow would bring. Morning came with the distant whistle of the eastbound train and the scent of coffee wafting up from the hotel kitchen. Grace dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a forest green that brought out the color of her eyes. Her lip was still swollen, but the cut had closed thanks to Emma's ministrations. A glance in the small mirror revealed what she already knew at 26. She was still young, but the last 6 years had taken their toll. Fine lines had formed around her eyes, and there was a wariness in her expression that hadn't been there when she'd first arrived in Caldwell as a hopeful young bride. The town was already stirring when she made her way downstairs. Emma greeted her with coffee and a plate of eggs and biscuits. Sheriff Dawson stopped by earlier, Emma informed her, refilling a drummer's coffee cup at the next table. Said the judge will be here day after tomorrow to hear the case. Harold's still in the jail. Grace nodded, trying to quell the anxiety rising in her chest. 2 days. 2 days of freedom, and then she would have to stand up in court and tell strangers about the private hell of her marriage. The hotel door swung open, and Wade Xanders ducked his head to enter, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He spotted Grace immediately, but approached with the careful deliberation of a man who didn't want to spook a wild horse. Mrs. Turner, he said with a slight nod. How are you feeling this morning? Better, thank you, Mr. Xanders, she replied, grateful that her voice didn't betray her nervousness. Mrs. Reynolds tells me I have you to thank for the room. Wade's sun-weathered face colored slightly. Least I could do. Sheriff says the judge is coming. Yes, day after tomorrow. Wade nodded, turning his hat in his hands. I'll delay my trip to Boise. Need to be here to testify anyway. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Thomas, the local Presbyterian minister. A thin man with a perpetually concerned expression, he made straight for Grace's table. Mrs. Turner, I've just heard. This is most distressing. He glanced sideways at Wade. And you must be the gentleman who intervened. Wade extended his hand. Wade Xanders. The Reverend shook it briefly before returning his attention to Grace. My dear, I've spoken with Harold this morning. He's most repentant. Says the devil got into him through the whiskey. Grace's hands tightened around her coffee cup. How many times had she heard this? How many bruises had faded while Harold promised it would never happen again? With all due respect, Reverend, Wade said, his tone mild but his eyes hard, I've found the devil doesn't need whiskey's help to find men who beat women. The Reverend straightened, affronted. Mr. Xanders, I don't believe we've seen you in our congregation. No, sir, you haven't, Wade agreed easily. But I reckon I know the difference between repentance and fear of consequences. An uncomfortable silence descended until Emma swept in with more coffee, chattering about the weather and effectively dismissing the Reverend, who left with a promise to pray for everyone involved. When he was gone, Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you, she said quietly to Wade. Reverend Thomas means well, but he's never had to live with Harold Turner, Wade finished for her. Their eyes met, and for the first time since he'd seen her on those depot steps, Wade saw a genuine smile touch Grace's lips. No, she agreed. He hasn't. Throughout that day and the next, Grace found herself drawn to Wade's steady presence. He made no demands, asked for nothing in return for his kindness, but was simply there walking her to the mercantile when she needed thread to mend a torn sleeve, sitting across from her at meals in the hotel dining room, telling stories of his travels that made her laugh despite herself. In turn, she found herself sharing pieces of her own story, how she'd come west from Pennsylvania after her parents died, hopeful for a fresh start. How Harold had seemed so charming during their courtship, showering her with attention and promises. How the first blow had come just weeks after their wedding, followed by tearful apologies and renewed vows to do better. Why did you stay? Wade asked as they sat on the hotel's small porch on the evening before the judge was due to arrive. The question wasn't accusatory, merely curious. Grace considered this, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. At first because I believed him when he said he'd change, then because I had nowhere else to go, eventually. She sighed. Eventually, because it was easier than admitting I'd made such a terrible mistake, Wade nodded, understanding in his eyes. My mother used to say that sometimes the bravest thing is to admit when you're wrong. Your mother sounds wise. She was, Wade confirmed, a touch of sadness in his voice. Died of fever when I was 16. My father followed 3 years later. I'm sorry, Grace said, meaning it. Do you have other family? Wade shook his head. Just my horses and whatever outfit I'm working for at the time. Been that way for a decade now. As night fell, bringing with it a coolness that belied the summer heat of the day, they spoke of lighter things, books they'd read, places they'd seen or hoped to see, childhood memories that brought smiles to their faces. It was the most peaceful evening Grace had experienced in years. Morning brought the arrival of Judge Carlton, a portly man with shrewd eyes who held court in the town hall. The room was packed partly with concerned citizens, but mostly with those hungry for scandal and gossip. Harold was brought in by Sheriff Dawson, looking considerably worse for wear after his days in jail. His eyes found Grace immediately, narrowing with barely concealed rage before darting to Wade, who sat beside her on the bench. The proceedings were mercifully brief. The judge heard testimony from Wade, from Grace, and from 2 witnesses who had seen the beginning of the altercation at the depot. Harold's defense consisted mainly of slurred accusations about his wife's supposed infidelity and claims that as her husband, he had every right to discipline her as he saw fit. Judge Carlton was unimpressed. Mr. Turner, he said finally, peering over his spectacles, this court finds you guilty of assault and public drunkenness. The law may be slow to extend its full protection to relations between husband and wife, but I will not have men beating women on the public streets of any town in my jurisdiction. He sentenced Harold to 30 days in the county jail with a fine of $50. Furthermore, the judge continued, Mrs. Turner, do you wish to petition for divorce on grounds of cruelty? A murmur ran through the courtroom. Divorce was rare, especially in small western towns. It carried a stigma that would follow Grace for years. She hesitated, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "Your Honor," she began, her voice stronger than she expected. "I do." Judge Carlton nodded. "Very well. The petition will be heard upon Mr. Turner's release from jail. Until then, Mrs. Turner is granted exclusive use of the marital home, and Mr. Turner is ordered to stay at least 100 yards from her person at all times following his release." Harold lunged to his feet, only to be firmly pushed back down by Sheriff Dawson. "She's my wife," he shouted. "You can't do this." "Mr. Turner," the judge said sharply, "one more outburst and I'll add contempt of court to your sentence. Do I make myself clear?" As Harold was led away, still protesting, Grace sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Freedom, or at least the promise of it, seemed suddenly, startlingly possible. Outside the town hall, the summer sun was high and bright. Wade stood awkwardly, hat in hand, as townspeople streamed past, some offering sympathetic nods to Grace, others deliberately looking away. "What will you do now?" he asked. Grace squared her shoulders. "Go home, I suppose. It's still my house, at least for now." Wade nodded, hesitating. "The auction in Boise starts tomorrow. I should be on my way." "Of course," Grace said quickly, ignoring the unexpected pang of disappointment. "You've already delayed your business too long on my account." "Mrs. Turner, Grace," Wade said, his voice dropping lower, "I'd be honored to escort you home first." The walk to Grace's small house on the edge of town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The modest clapboard structure came into view, and Grace felt a curious mix of dread and relief. This had been both her prison and her sanctuary for 6 years. "Will you be safe here?" Wade asked as they reached the front gate. "Harold has friends in town." "Sheriff Dawson promised to keep an eye out," Grace assured him. "And the neighbors across the way, the Millers, they've always been kind." Wade seemed unconvinced. "I don't like leaving you alone." "Mr. Xanders," Grace said gently, "you've done more for me in 3 days than anyone has in 6 years. I can't ask for more." He studied her face for a long moment, then reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper. "This is the name of the ranch where I'll be working after boys. If you need anything at all, send word there." Grace accepted the paper, carefully tucking it into her reticule. "Thank you." As Wade turned to go, he hesitated, then spoke without looking back. "I'll be passing through Caldwell again in about a month. If you'd permit it, I'd like to call on you then." A warmth spread through Grace's chest, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Xanders." "Wade," he corrected with a small smile, finally meeting her eyes again. "My friends call me Wade." "Wade," she repeated, returning his smile. "Safe travels." She watched him walk away, tall and straight-backed, until he disappeared around the corner. Then, taking a deep breath, Grace Turner opened the gate and walked toward her house alone, but for the first time in years, not afraid. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity for Grace. With Harold safely behind bars, she threw herself into reclaiming her life and her home. Years of walking on eggshells had left their mark. She found herself startling at unexpected sounds, tensing when male voices grew loud in the street outside. But there were good days, too. Emma Reynolds became a frequent visitor, bringing not just friendship but practical advice about living independently. The local dressmaker, Mrs. Chen, offered Grace part-time work helping with fine stitching, providing both income and companionship during long afternoons. "You've got a steady hand," Mrs. Chen observed one day as Grace completed an intricate bit of embroidery on a wedding dress. "And an eye for beauty." Grace blushed at the compliment. "My mother taught me. She always said a woman should have skills to call her own." Mrs. Chen, a tiny woman who had come from China to join her merchant husband 20 years earlier, nodded approvingly. "Your mother was wise. A woman needs roots of her own, not just those of her husband." Nights were the hardest. The empty house seemed to echo with memories, and Grace often found herself sitting up late, lamp burning, wondering what the future held. Divorce was uncommon enough that she had few examples to follow. Would she stay in Caldwell, facing the whispers and stares? Move to a larger town where anonymity might provide a fresh start? And then there was Wade Xanders. His promised visit loomed larger in her thoughts with each passing day. She'd known the man barely 72 hours, yet his steady presence had left an impression deeper than she cared to admit. "You're sweet on that cowboy," Emma declared one evening as they shared tea on Grace's porch. "It wasn't a question." "I hardly know him," Grace protested, though she could feel color rising in her cheeks. Emma snorted. "Sometimes you know a person's character in an instant. Takes years to learn their habits and histories, sure enough, but character, that shows quick in a crisis." Grace couldn't argue with that logic. In the moment Wade had stepped between her and Harold's rage, he had revealed more about himself than many men she'd known for years. "Besides," Emma added with a wink, "he's easy on the eyes, that one." Grace laughed, surprising herself with the sound. When had she last laughed freely? "Emma Reynolds, you're shameless." "At my age, dear, I've earned the right to appreciate a fine figure of a man without acting on it," Emma replied, unrepentant. "You, on the other hand—" "I'm still married," Grace reminded her, sobering quickly. Emma's expression softened. "Not for long. And then, my dear, you have every right to pursue happiness wherever and with whomever you find it." 3 weeks after the trial, Sheriff Dawson appeared at Grace's door with news. "Judge Carlton's expedited your divorce petition," he explained, handing her an official-looking document. "Says given the public nature of the assault and the witnesses, there's no need to wait for the full 30 days of Harold's sentence." Grace stared at the paper in disbelief. "So I'm free as a bird, Miss Turner," Dawson confirmed, correcting himself with a small smile. "Effective immediately." That night, Grace sat alone at her kitchen table, the divorce decree spread before her. Grace Abigail Turner, restored to the status of unmarried woman. She traced the words with her finger, trying to absorb their reality. Freedom had come so suddenly she hardly knew what to do with it. For 6 years, her life had been circumscribed by Harold's moods and demands. Now, every choice was hers alone. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. A week later, Harold Turner was released from jail. True to his word, Sheriff Dawson kept a close eye on him, but Harold seemed subdued, spending most of his time at his brother's house on the other side of town. When Grace passed him on the street, he merely glowered from a distance. "He's leaving town," Reverend Thomas informed Grace after Sunday services. "His brother's got him work at a logging camp up north. Feels it might be best for everyone." Grace nodded, relief washing over her. "I think that's wise." The Reverend hesitated, then added, "The Lord teaches forgiveness, Miss Turner." "And I will forgive in time," Grace replied evenly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Reverend, nor does it mean putting myself in harm's way again." The older man looked startled at her directness but recovered quickly. "Of course, I merely meant I know what you meant," Grace said, softening her tone. "And I appreciate your concern, but my path forward is my own to determine now." As the promised month drew to a close, Grace found herself watching the road into town with increasing frequency. There had been no word from Wade, not that she had truly expected any. A cowboy's life was nomadic and unpredictable. Promises to return were often made with good intentions but broken by circumstance. Still, she hoped. The first day of August dawned hot and clear, promising another scorcher of an Idaho summer day. Grace rose early, unable to sleep in the muggy heat of her bedroom. She dressed in her coolest dress, a light blue cotton with small white flowers embroidered around the collar, her own handiwork, completed during those long evenings alone. Mrs. Chen had given her the day off, and with no other pressing obligations, Grace decided to walk to the mercantile for supplies. Her garden was producing well this year, too well for one person, in fact. She'd been preserving vegetables for winter and had run low on canning jars. The main street was quiet in the early morning heat. A few shopkeepers were sweeping their storefronts, and the blacksmith's forge was already glowing as she passed. Grace returned their greetings with a smile, noting with satisfaction that there was less pity in their eyes now, more genuine warmth. She was examining canning jars at the mercantile when the bell over the door jangled. Glancing up, Grace felt her heart skip as Wade Xanders ducked through the doorway, removing his hat as he entered. He spotted her immediately, and the smile that spread across his face made her suddenly conscious of every detail of her appearance: the wisps of hair escaping her bun, the perspiration on her brow from the walk into town. "Miss Turner," he said, crossing to her in a few long strides. I was hoping I'd find you in town. Mr. Xanders, she replied, flustered by his sudden appearance. You remembered, Wade, he corrected gently. And of course I remembered. Been counting the days, if I'm honest. There was an openness to his expression that Grace found disarming. Most men, she knew, guarded their feelings carefully, considering emotional transparency a weakness. But Wade Xanders looked at her with clear blue eyes that hid nothing: his pleasure at seeing her again, his concern for her welfare, and something else, something that made her cheeks warm. How long are you in Caldwell? She asked, setting down the canning jar she'd been inspecting. A few days, at least, he replied. Got business with the bank about a small piece of land I'm considering. Grace's eyebrows rose in surprise. Land here in Caldwell. Wade nodded, a hint of color touching his tanned face. 20 acres about 3 miles west of town. Good water, decent grazing. Been thinking it might be time to put down some roots. The implications of this statement hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. I see, Grace said finally. That's quite a change from the traveling life. A man gets tired of the trail eventually, Wade said simply, starts wanting something more permanent. He hesitated, then added, I was wondering if you might join me for supper tonight at the hotel Emma Mrs. Reynolds says she's roasting a chicken. The invitation was proper enough: a public place, a respectable establishment. Still, Grace knew there would be talk. A divorced woman dining with a bachelor would raise eyebrows even in a bigger town than Caldwell. But looking at Wade's hopeful expression, Grace found she didn't care what people might say. I'd be delighted, she answered. Supper that evening was the first of many shared meals over the next week. Each day, Wade would appear at Grace's door, hat in hand, with a new invitation: a picnic by the river, a visit to the new schoolhouse being built on the edge of town, a walk to see the property he was considering purchasing. With each hour in his company, Grace felt layers of caution and fear peeling away. Wade was everything Harold was not: patient, considerate, attentive without being possessive. He listened when she spoke, really listened, and shared his own thoughts openly. My father taught me that a man's word is his bond, he told her as they sat on the bank of the Boys River, watching the sunset paint the water gold. But more than that, he showed me by example. He never raised his hand to my mother, never even raised his voice. Said a real man doesn't need to intimidate to lead. He sounds like a good man, Grace observed, trailing her fingers through the cool grass beside the blanket Wade had spread for their picnic. He was, Wade agreed. Wish you could have met him. He'd have liked you. Said a woman with spirit makes the best partner in life. The word partner lingered in the air between them, full of possibility. And what do you think? Grace asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Wade's eyes met hers, serious and intent. I think he was right. I think a man needs a woman who speaks her mind, who stands as his equal. Anything less is just loneliness disguised as companionship. On the 8th day of Wade's stay in Caldwell, they walked together to the property he'd purchased, the deal having been finalized the day before. 23 acres of rolling grassland with a small creek cutting through it, a stand of cottonwoods offering shade, and views of the distant mountains to the north. It's beautiful, Grace said as they crested a small rise, revealing the full extent of the land. What will you call it? Wade considered this, squinting against the afternoon sun. Haven't thought that far ahead, he admitted. Any suggestions? Grace looked around, taking in the wildflowers nodding in the breeze, the glint of the creek in the distance. New beginnings, she suggested softly. Wade's hand found hers, large and calloused but gentle as it enfolded her smaller one. That's perfect, he said, his voice rough with emotion, because that's what I'm hoping for. He turned to face her fully, still holding her hand. Grace, I know it hasn't been long. Some might say it's too soon, especially after what you've been through, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as Wade dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hand. I love you, Grace Turner. I think I started falling the moment I saw you on those depot steps, not just because you needed help, but because even then, beaten down as you were, I saw the strength in you. I'm asking if you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not because you need protection or security, but because I believe we could build something beautiful together. Tears blurred Grace's vision as she looked down at this man, this good, honorable man who had changed the course of her life with one act of courage. Wade, she began, her voice trembling. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't afraid. Marriage hasn't been kind to me." "I know," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "And if you need time, or if the answer is no, I'll understand. But I promise you this: every day of our life together would be built on respect, on partnership, on the kind of love that lifts up rather than tears down." Grace took a deep breath, searching her heart. The fear was there, yes, but beneath it was something stronger, something that had been growing steadily over the past month, something that felt remarkably like hope. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Wade Xanders, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He rose to his feet and with infinite tenderness drew her into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise exchanged without words as the Idaho wind whispered around them and the late summer sun bathed them in golden light. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a small ceremony in Caldwell's Presbyterian church. Emma Reynolds stood as Grace's witness, beaming like a proud mother. The Chens provided flowers from their garden, and Mrs. Chen herself had worked late into the night to finish Grace's simple but elegant ivory dress. Sheriff Dawson and his wife were there, along with several other townspeople who had become friends during Grace's months of independence. Even Reverend Thomas, who had initially expressed concern about the hasty nature of the engagement, admitted that he had rarely seen a couple better suited to one another. Harold Turner, true to rumor, had left town the week before, heading north with his brother to the logging camp. His shadow no longer fell across Grace's path. As Wade slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Grace felt the last vestiges of her old life falling away. The woman who had cowered on the depot steps seemed like someone from a half-remembered dream connected to her present self by experience, but no longer defining who she was or could become. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thomas declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Wade's kiss was tender but carried a promise of passion that made Grace blush as the small congregation applauded. They spent their wedding night at the Caldwell Hotel, in a room Emma had personally prepared with fresh flowers and linens. Grace had been nervous, her only experience of physical intimacy tainted by Harold's rough, selfish demands. But Wade was as gentle and considerate a lover as he was a man. He took his time, asking permission with words and touches, responding to her every cue until Grace discovered, to her amazement, that love between a man and a woman could indeed be beautiful, mutual, and deeply satisfying. "I love you, Mrs. Xanders," he whispered as they lay tangled in the sheets, her head resting on his chest. "And I love you," she replied, the words still new and wondrous on her lips. "More than I thought possible." The next morning, they loaded Grace's few cherished possessions onto Wade's wagon and left Caldwell behind, heading for their new land. There was no house yet, just the foundation Wade had started laying during their engagement, but he'd constructed a snug cabin for them to live in while they built their permanent home. "It's not much," he apologized as they approached the small structure nestled among the cottonwoods. "But it's sturdy and the roof doesn't leak." Grace surveyed the cabin with its fresh-cut pine walls and river stone chimney. A vegetable garden had been started nearby and a corral for the horses stood ready. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it, "our home." Wade lifted her from the wagon seat as easily as if she weighed nothing, setting her gently on the ground before their new door. Then, to her surprise and delight, he swept her into his arms. "Threshold's supposed to be lucky," he explained with a grin, carrying her inside to begin their life together. The months that followed were the happiest of Grace's life. Together they worked from sunup to sundown, building not just a house but a home. Wade proved as skilled with an axe and saw as he was with horses, and Grace's garden flourished under her careful tending. They faced challenges, of course. An early autumn storm nearly took the roof off the cabin before their house was complete. A mountain lion killed 2 of their chickens before Wade tracked and dispatched it. Grace burned her hand badly while learning to use the new cast iron stove Wade had hauled all the way from Boise. But each challenge they met together, as partners, each contributing their strengths to overcome whatever obstacles arose. By Christmas, Their house was finished a sturdy two-story structure with a wide porch and large windows that caught the winter sunlight. Grace had sewn curtains and quilts, transforming the new-built rooms into cozy spaces that reflected their shared tastes. As they sat before the fire on Christmas Eve, Wade presented Grace with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. They'd agreed to keep gifts simple, practical. "Open it," he urged, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. Inside the package was a leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with an intricate design of wildflowers similar to those that had dotted their land when he'd proposed. "For your thoughts, your dreams, your memories," Wade explained. "You told me once that Harold never wanted you to write, said it was a waste of time. I want you to write anything and everything that comes to mind." Tears pricked Grace's eyes as she traced the beautiful design with her fingertips. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's perfect." "There's an inscription," he said, suddenly shy. Grace opened the cover to find Wade's strong, slightly uneven handwriting. "To my beloved Grace, whose strength and beauty humble me daily. May these pages hold the story of our new beginning. All my love, Wade." She looked up to find him watching her, love and uncertainty mingled in his expression. "Do you like it?" "I know it's not much compared to." Grace silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they finally parted, she rested her forehead against his. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received, but I have something for you too, something I can't wrap." Wade raised an eyebrow, curiosity lighting his features. Grace took his hand and placed it gently over her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. "In summer." Wade's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to joy in the span of heartbeats. "A baby," he whispered. "You're sure?" Grace nodded, her own joy reflected in his eyes. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when I went into town for supplies." Wade gathered her carefully into his arms as if she had suddenly become fragile as spun glass. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." That night, as Wade slept beside her, Grace wrote the first entry in her new journal. "1 year ago, I was a woman trapped in a nightmare, believing that was all life had to offer me. Today, I am beloved, respected, and carrying new life beneath my heart. This is the miracle of second chances, of courage, of love that sees beyond brokenness to possibility. Wade sleeps beside me, his hand protectively spread across my still flat belly. How different this man is from the one I once called husband. Wade's strength is in his gentleness, his power in his restraint. He builds rather than destroys, loves rather than possesses. Our child will know only this kind of love, patient, kind, unselfish. They will grow in a home where voices are never raised in anger, where hands are used to help and hold, never to hurt. This is my new beginning. This is my miracle." Spring came early to their little ranch, which they had indeed named New Beginnings. The creek swelled with snowmelt from the mountains, and the land turned emerald with fresh growth. Grace's garden expanded, and Wade added 2 milk cows and a dozen more chickens to their growing farm. As her body changed with the advancing pregnancy, Grace found herself cherishing the ways Wade cared for her, insisting she rest during the hottest part of the day, taking over the heavier garden work, reading to her in the evenings as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "What shall we name him?" Wade asked one evening, his hand gently caressing the swell of her belly where their child grew. "Him," Grace teased. "So certain it's a boy," Wade grinned. "Just a feeling. But if it's a girl, that would be perfect too." Grace considered, watching a hawk circle lazily over their field. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after your father. What was his name?" "Thomas," Wade replied, looking touched. "Thomas James Xanders." "Thomas it is then," Grace decided. "And if it's a girl, your mother's name." Wade suggested. Grace nodded. Elizabeth Emma Xanders." "Perfect," Wade agreed, kissing her temple. Either way. Summer arrived with blazing heat and the promise of a bountiful harvest to come. Grace's time grew near, and Wade rode into Caldwell to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Donovan, to stay with them until the baby arrived. The labor began on a sweltering July afternoon as Grace was arranging wildflowers on the kitchen table. The first pain doubled her over, water soaking her skirts as she clutched the table edge. "Wade." She called, a tremor of fear in her voice despite months of preparation. He was at her side in an instant, having been never far from the house in recent weeks. His face showed concern but no panic as he helped her to their bedroom, where Mrs. Donovan was already turning down the sheets. "It's time then," the midwife said briskly. "Mr. Xanders, fetch the hot water and clean linens we prepared, then you can wait downstairs." But Grace clutched Wade's hand. "No," she said firmly, "I want him with me." Mrs. Donovan looked scandalized. "It's not proper for a man to, he's my husband and I need him," Grace insisted, another contraction building. "Please," the midwife sighed but relented. "Very well. But you'll do exactly as I say, Mr. Xanders. No fainting or getting in the way." Wade nodded solemnly. "Yes, madam." The hours that followed tested Grace's strength and Wade's composure. Labor was long and difficult, the summer heat making it all the more challenging. But through each contraction, each moment of fear and pain, Wade was there wiping her brow, supporting her back, murmuring encouragement. "You're the strongest person I know," he told her as she struggled through a particularly difficult contraction. "You can do this, my love. You're doing wonderfully." Just as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to both his parents' eyes. "A boy," Mrs. Donovan announced, quickly cleaning and wrapping the infant. "A fine, healthy boy." She placed the tiny bundle in Grace's arms, and for the first time, Grace looked upon the face of her son. Dark hair like Wade's dusted his perfect head, but when his eyes blinked open briefly, she glimpsed her own green eyes looking back at her. "Hello, Thomas," she whispered, tracing a finger along his velvet cheek. "We've been waiting for you." Wade sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Grace's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's tiny fingers. "He's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're both perfect." Mrs. Donovan, for all her earlier protests, looked on with approval. "You did well, Mrs. Xanders, both of you did." After the midwife had helped clean up and ensured that both mother and baby were resting comfortably, she left them alone, going downstairs to prepare some food for the new father. In the quiet of their bedroom, illuminated only by a single lamp, Grace and Wade marveled at the miracle they had created together. "I never thought I could be this happy," Grace confessed, watching as Thomas nuzzled against her, seeking nourishment with instinctive determination. "This blessed." Wade's arm tightened around her shoulders. "You deserve every happiness, my love, every blessing." As Thomas settled into nursing, Wade reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I had this made in town last month," he explained, opening his palm to reveal a delicate silver locket. "Open it." Grace did, carefully balancing Thomas with one arm. Inside were two tiny sketches, one of herself, one of Wade, expertly rendered by Mrs. Chen's artist son. "Now we'll need to add one of Thomas," Wade said. "But I thought you might like having us close to your heart." Grace looked up at her husband, this man who continually found new ways to show his love. "Help me put it on." Wade fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin in a caress that promised more once she had healed from the birth. "I love you, Grace Xanders," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You and Thomas are my whole world, and you are ours," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace as their son dozed contentedly against her breast. "My hero, my love, my new beginning." Outside their window, a shooting star streaked across the summer sky, a fleeting moment of brilliance marking the start of their family's journey together. 5 years later, the ranch called New Beginnings had transformed from a promising patch of land to a thriving homestead. The original cabin still stood, now serving as a bunkhouse for the 2 ranch hands Wade employed to help with the expanding herd of cattle and horses. The main house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. Thomas, now an energetic 5-year-old with his father's charm and his mother's quick mind, had been joined by 3-year-old Elizabeth, a spirited little girl with copper curls and a contagious laugh. On a crisp October morning, Grace stood on the porch, her hands resting on her once again swollen belly, watching as Wade taught Thomas to lead a gentle mare around the corral. "Small steps, son," Wade instructed, his patience seemingly endless. "Let her know you're in charge, but be gentle. A good horseman never needs to be rough." Thomas nodded seriously, his small face a study in concentration as he followed his father's guidance. The mare, sensing the child's nervousness, lowered her head obligingly, making the task easier. "Mama, look," Thomas called excitedly. "I'm doing it." "I see, darling," Grace called back, smiling at the pride in her son's voice. "You're a natural, just like your father." Elizabeth tugged at Grace's skirts, not to be outdone by her brother. "Me too, Mama, me ride too." Grace laughed, bending as best she could with her 7-month pregnant belly to lift the little girl into her arms. "When you're a bit bigger, sweetheart. For now, you can help me bake the apple pie for supper. Would you like that?" Elizabeth nodded enthusiastically, her green eyes so like Grace's own lighting up at the prospect. As they turned to go inside, a rider appeared at the edge of their property, coming fast along the road from town. Grace shaded her eyes, recognizing Sheriff Dawson's distinctive silhouette. "Wade," she called, suddenly anxious. The sheriff rarely rode out this far unless there was trouble. Wade looked up, following her gaze. He lifted Thomas out of the corral, setting him safely on the fence. "Stay here with your sister, son. I need to speak with Sheriff Dawson." Grace met Wade at the bottom of the porch steps, and together they waited as Dawson reined in his horse, dust billowing around them. "Wade, Grace," the sheriff greeted them, touching the brim of his hat. "Sorry to disturb your morning. What brings you all the way out here, Sheriff?" Wade asked, his arm automatically going around Grace's shoulders in a protective gesture that had become second nature. Dawson dismounted, his expression grim. "Thought you should hear this from me before town gossip reached you. Harold Turner's back in Caldwell." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. 5 years had passed without a word or sign of her former husband. She'd begun to believe he was gone for good, perhaps even dead. "What does he want?" Wade asked, his voice tight. Dawson sighed. "Been making noise in the saloon about unfinished business." "Drunk, mostly, but mean drunk. Thought you should know, take precautions." Wade's arm tightened around Grace. "He comes near my family, he'll regret it." "That's what I'm afraid of," Dawson said frankly. "I don't want trouble, Wade, not for you, not for anyone. I've warned him to stay away, told him you're both legally married, got a family, but he's not listening to reason." Grace found her voice at last. "Can't you arrest him for threatening us?" "He hasn't made specific threats yet," Dawson explained. "Just vague talk, not enough to hold him." He paused. "But I've got deputies watching him. He makes one wrong move, we'll have him back in jail." After the sheriff left, promising to send word of any developments, Wade and Grace sat at their kitchen table, the children playing outside under the watchful eye of Maria, their housekeeper. "I won't let him hurt you," Wade promised, holding Grace's trembling hands. "Not you, not our children. Never," Grace nodded, trying to calm the fear that had risen like bile in her throat. "I know, it's just, I thought this was behind us. I thought we were safe." "We are safe," Wade insisted. "This is our home, our land. Harold Turner has no power here." But that night, after the children were asleep, Grace woke to find Wade sitting by the window, his rifle across his knees, watching the moonlit yard with vigilant eyes. "Come back to bed," she urged, though she understood his worry. Wade shook his head. "Just being careful," he said quietly. "Go back to sleep, love. Everything's fine," but everything wasn't fine. 2 days later, as Grace worked in her garden with Elizabeth, helping by digging small holes alongside her mother's careful rows, she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Looking up, she saw a figure on horseback at the edge of their property, too distant to identify clearly but watching the house with unmistakable intent. By the time Wade returned from the north pasture, where he'd been mending fences, the rider was gone. But the sense of being watched, of danger hovering just beyond their boundaries, remained. "Perhaps we should go stay in town for a while," Grace suggested that evening. "With Emma or the Chens." Wade considered this, his expression troubled. "Might be safer," he admitted reluctantly. "At least for you and the children." "I won't leave you here alone," Grace said firmly. "And I won't risk you or our children," Wade countered. "If Harold's looking for trouble, better he finds just me." Their debate was interrupted by the sound of hooves in the yard, multiple riders, approaching fast. Wade grabbed his rifle from beside the door, moving to the window with the practiced caution of a frontiersman. "Sheriff Dawson," he reported, relief evident in his voice, "and 2 deputies." He set the rifle down and opened the door as the lawman dismounted. Dawson's expression was grave as he removed his hat, nodding to Grace. "Evening, folks. Sorry to disturb you again." "What's happened?" Wade asked, ushering the men inside. Dawson accepted the cup of coffee Grace offered, warming his hands around it before speaking. Harold Turner left town this afternoon, drunk and armed. His brother tried to stop him, said Harold was raving about settling scores. He looked directly at Grace. Specifically with you, madam. Grace sank into a chair, one hand protectively covering her unborn child. Did he say where he was going? No, but there's only so many places he could be headed, Dawson replied. We've got men watching the roads, but he hesitated. Well, he knows this country could be taking back trails. Wade's jaw tightened. You think he's coming here? It wasn't a question, but Dawson nodded anyway. Seems likely. That's why we're here, to make sure he doesn't cause trouble. For the next 2 days, Sheriff Dawson and his deputies remained at New Beginnings, taking turns standing watch. Wade moved the children into the master bedroom with Grace, sleeping himself on a cot in the hallway outside their door. It's like being under siege, Grace observed on the morning of the 3rd day, watching from the kitchen window as one of the deputies patrolled the perimeter of their property. How long can this go on? As long as it takes, Wade said firmly, pouring coffee for both of them. Dawson sent word to the county marshal. If Harold doesn't show up soon, they'll organize a proper search. The siege ended that afternoon, but not in the way any of them had anticipated. Wade was in the barn with Thomas, showing him how to groom the mare when they heard a woman scream from the direction of the house. Wade's blood ran cold. It was Grace's voice. Stay here, he ordered Thomas, pushing the boy behind a stack of hay bales. Don't come out until I call for you. He burst from the barn, pistol drawn, to find a scene from his worst nightmares unfolding in the yard. Harold Turner, unshaven and wild-eyed, had Grace by the arm, a knife pressed to her throat. Elizabeth clung to her mother's skirts, sobbing in terror. The deputies were nowhere to be seen, and Sheriff Dawson lay motionless on the ground nearby, blood staining his shirt. Let them go, Turner, Wade called, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. This is between you and me. Harold's laugh was harsh, manic. Nothing's between you and me, Xanders. You took what was mine. Now I'm taking it back. Grace's eyes met Wade's across the yard, and in them he saw not just fear but a fierce determination. Her hand moved slightly, stroking Elizabeth's head in what appeared to be comfort, but actually moved the child incrementally away from Harold's reach. Harold, Grace said, her voice remarkably calm, you're hurting me, and you're frightening Elizabeth. Please let us go and we can talk about this like civilized people. Civilized? Harold snarled, the knife pressing closer to her throat. Was it civilized when you humiliated me, when you took everything I had and gave it to him? He jerked his head toward Wade. I never took anything that was truly yours, Grace replied, wincing as the knife's edge bit into her skin. Not your dignity, not your pride. You lost those yourself with your own actions. Harold's face contorted with rage. Shut up, he hissed. Always thought you were so smart, didn't you? Well, you're not smart enough to save yourself now. Wade took a careful step forward, his gun trained on Harold. Last chance, Turner, let my wife and daughter go. Harold's grip on Grace tightened. Wife, he spat. She's my wife, mine. Not for 5 years, Wade reminded him, taking another step. You lost that right when you beat her on those depot steps. Remember that day, Harold? I do. Every detail. Harold's eyes flickered with uncertainty, the knife wavering slightly. In that moment of distraction, Grace acted. She drove her elbow hard into Harold's stomach, simultaneously shoving Elizabeth clear and twisting away from the knife. The blade sliced across her arm instead of her throat, drawing blood but missing anything vital. Harold staggered back, momentarily stunned by her resistance. Wade didn't hesitate. His bullet caught Harold in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. The knife fell from his hand, landing in the dust. Before Harold could recover, Wade was on him, kicking the knife well out of reach and pressing the barrel of his gun against the man's temple. Give me one reason not to end you right now, Wade growled, fury unlike anything he'd ever felt coursing through his veins. Wade, no. Grace called, clutching her bleeding arm. Not in front of Elizabeth, not like this. Her words penetrated the red haze of Wade's anger. He looked up to see his daughter watching with huge, frightened eyes, and his son, who had disobeyed orders to stay hidden, standing in the barn doorway, equally terrified. You're right, Wade said, stepping back but keeping his gun trained on Harold, who was now groaning in pain, blood soaking his filthy shirt. Kids, go inside with your mother, now. Elizabeth ran to Grace, who gathered her close with her uninjured arm. Thomas hesitated, then joined them. Together, they hurried into the house. On the ground nearby, Sheriff Dawson stirred, raising a hand to his bloodied head. "What I miss?" he mumbled, struggling to sit up. Wade quickly explained the situation, keeping Harold covered as the sheriff regained his bearings. The deputies, it turned out, had been ambushed by Harold as they patrolled the far end of the property, one knocked unconscious, the other tied up in the old cabin. "Clever bastard," Dawson muttered, checking his own gun. "Waited till we got complacent, spread too thin." Together, they secured Harold, binding his wounds enough to keep him from bleeding out before he could face justice. The man had fallen into a sullen silence, all the fight gone out of him with his failure. "He'll hang for this," Dawson said as they loaded Harold into a wagon for the journey back to Caldwell. "Attempted murder, assault on law officers. The judge won't be lenient this time," Wade nodded grimly. "Just get him away from my family." Inside the house, Grace sat at the kitchen table while Maria cleaned and bandaged her arm, the children watching solemnly from the corner where they'd been told to stay. "You were very brave, Mama," Thomas said, his young face serious. "Like in the stories you tell us." Grace managed a smile, though her hands still trembled from the ordeal. "Sometimes being brave is just doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared." When Wade entered, having seen Dawson and the deputies off with their prisoner, the children ran to him. He knelt, gathering them into a fierce hug before releasing them to check on Grace. "Let me see," he insisted, gently examining Maria's handiwork. The cut was long but shallow, painful but not dangerous. Still, the sight of his wife's blood made Wade's chest tighten with renewed anger. "I'm fine," Grace assured him, reading his expression. "We all are." That night, after the children were finally asleep, exhausted from their frightening day, Wade and Grace sat on their porch in the darkness, a blanket wrapped around both of them despite the mild evening. "I could have lost you today," Wade said quietly, his arm tight around her shoulders. "All of you." Grace leaned into his embrace, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "But you didn't. We're safe now, truly safe, I think," Wade nodded slowly. "Dawson will make sure of it this time. There won't be another chance for Harold to hurt you." They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the night sounds of their ranch, the soft lowing of cattle in the distant pasture, the whisper of wind in the cottonwoods, the occasional hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness. "Do you know what I thought of today when he had that knife at my throat?" Grace asked finally, Wade tensed beside her. "What?" "I thought of that day at the depot, how hopeless I felt, how trapped, and then how everything changed when you stepped forward." She turned to look at him, her face silvered by moonlight. "You saved me then, and you've been saving me every day since, not by fighting my battles for me, but by believing I was worth fighting for it all." Wade brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You saved yourself today, Grace. I just provided backup." Grace smiled at that. "Perhaps we saved each other. Perhaps that's what love really is, not one person rescuing another, but two people standing together against whatever comes." "I like that definition," Wade agreed, his eyes warm as they met hers. "And I plan to keep standing with you for the rest of our lives." 2 months later, on a clear December morning, their second son was born, James Dawson Xanders, named for Wade's father and the sheriff who had helped protect their family. The birth was easier than Thomas's had been, and by evening, Grace was sitting up in bed, cradling the infant while Wade and the children gathered around to admire their newest family member. "He has your nose, Papa," Elizabeth declared, peering closely at her tiny brother. "Poor kid," Wade joked, earning a gentle swat from Grace. Thomas, now taking his role as eldest very seriously, stood protectively at his mother's side. "I'll teach him everything, Mama, how to ride, how to fish in the creek. Everything." "I'm sure you will, sweetheart," Grace agreed, smiling at her firstborn. "He's lucky to have such a good big brother." As the children chatted excitedly about their plans for teaching the baby all manner of skills he wouldn't need for years, Wade sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting lightly on Grace's shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. Grace looked around at her family, her strong, kind husband, her bright, brave children. The newest life nestled against her heart, and felt a completeness that once would have seemed impossible. More than I ever dreamed possible, she answered truthfully. This is everything, Wade. Everything I never knew I needed. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting new beginnings with a gentle blanket of white, covering the scars of the past and promising a clean slate for tomorrow. Inside, warmed by love and the simple joy of being together, the Xanders family welcomed the future, secure in the knowledge that whatever it held, they would face it together. Years later, Grace would write in her journal, now one of many volumes filled with the daily record of their life together. It's been 20 years since that day at the depot steps, when a stranger's courage changed the course of my life. Our children are grown now, Thomas running his own ranch nearby, Elizabeth teaching at the Caldwell school, James studying medicine back east. Wade's hair has more silver than brown these days, and my hands show the marks of 2 decades of hard work and love. Yesterday, a young woman came to our door seeking refuge from a violent husband. Wade brought her in without hesitation, just as he once intervened for me. Tonight she sleeps safely in our spare room, her future uncertain but her present secure. And I am reminded once again of how a single act of courage can ripple outward, touching lives we never imagined reaching. Wade doesn't consider himself a hero, never has. But to that young woman, to our children, to me, he is exactly that. Not because he is perfect or invincible, but because when confronted with cruelty, he chooses kindness. When faced with injustice, he stands for what is right. Our new beginning has become a life rich beyond measure, not in gold or property, but in love freely given and gratefully received. In the end, I believe that is the only wealth that truly matters.